You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. If you are listening to the podcast of this, it is located at RudolfSteiner.podbean.com. Please consider becoming a patron. Lecture 12 of the lecture cycle by Rudolf Steiner, Practical Advice to Teachers, given on September 3rd, 1919. We must not close our minds to the fact that the relationship human beings have with their environment is far more complex than simply those aspects of which we are always conscious. From various points of view, I have tried to clarify for you the nature and significance of the unconscious and subconscious workings of the soul. In the sphere of education and educational methods, it is particularly important that human beings should be brought up in a way that suits not only their conscious being, but also their subconscious and unconscious soul forces. To be a real educator and teacher, you cannot avoid entering into the subtleties of the human being. We have come to know the three stages of human development between the change of teeth and puberty. We must be quite clear that in addition to the conscious realm, the subconscious plays a large part, particularly in the last of these stages, a part that is significant for the whole future of the human being. By looking at this matter from another point of view, I would like to make clear to you why this is so. Just think how many people today travel by electric train without having the faintest idea how an electric train is set in motion. Imagine even how many people see a steam engine rushing by without having any clue as to the workings of physics and mechanics that propel it. Consider what position such ignorance puts us in with regard to our relationship with our environment, that very environment we use for our convenience. We live in a world that has been brought about by human beings, that has been formed by human thoughts, that we use and know nothing about. The fact that we understand nothing about something that has been formed by human beings and is fundamentally the result of human thinking is greatly significant for the whole mood of soul and spirit of humankind. Human beings literally have to turn a deaf ear in order not to perceive the resulting effects. It is always very satisfying to notice how people from the better classes, now I do not want to offend anyone with my turn of phrase, enter a factory and feel thoroughly ill at ease. This happens because there shoots up from their subconscious the feeling that they use the things that are manufactured in the factory without having the slightest relationship as human beings with what goes on there. They know nothing about it. When you sense the discomfiture of inveterate cigarette smokers, to take a familiar example, when they enter the Waldorf Astoria cigarette factory, knowing nothing about what takes place there so that they can be kept supplied with cigarettes, you can be pleased by the fact that at least they can still dimly perceive their ignorance. They are ignorant about the environment born out of human thoughts, the environment in which they live and from which they obtain the goods they use. We can be glad if people enter and leave an electric train with a slight feeling of unease, because they have no idea how it works. This discomfiture is the first inkling of an improvement in this realm. The very worst thing is to experience and live in a world made by human beings without bothering ourselves about this world. We can work against these things only by starting during the last stage of the lower school. We must really not let the 15 and 16-year-olds leave school without at least elementary ideas about the more important processes taking place in life. We should teach them in a way that leaves them with a yearning to be curious and inquisitive at every opportunity about what is going on around them, so that they use this curiosity and thirst for knowledge to add to whatever they already know. At the end of the lower school years, we should employ all the different subjects in a comprehensive sense toward a social education of our students, just as we use the separate subjects in geography to build an overall geographical structure, in the way I described in my previous lecture. In other words, we must not neglect to use the concepts learned earlier about physics and natural history to introduce the children to the industrial processes closest to them. At age 15 or 16, they should have gained an idea of what goes on in a soap factory or a spinning mill. Naturally, we shall have to proceed as economically as possible. It is always possible to condense out of the overall complicated process a simple generalized picture. I think Mr. Molt will agree that one could teach children briefly about the whole process of cigarette manufacturing from beginning to end in a few simple sentences, which would then need only a little explanation taken from the rest of the subjects we have taught them. Footnote: Emil Molt, 1876 to 1936, was head of the Waldorf cigarette factory in Stuttgart, where Rudolf Steiner was first invited to introduce his educational methods into practice. End of footnote. It is entirely beneficial for children between the ages of 13 and 16 to be given such condensed descriptions of different branches of industry. It would be very good if during these years they were to keep a notebook in which to record the processes of soap manufacture, cigarette production, spinning, weaving, and so on. They need not be taught about mechanical and chemical technology on a grand scale, but they would gain a great deal from keeping such a notebook. Even if the book were later to be lost, a residue would remain. They would not simply have the benefit of knowing these things, but, more important, they would feel, as they went through life and their profession, that they had once known these things, that they had been once through the process of learning about them. This affects the assurance with which people act. It affects the self-possession with which they take their place in the world. It is very important for the willpower and the capacity for making decisions. No profession is without people of efficiency and initiative who occupy their place in the world with the feeling that they once knew about things they do not actually need for their own profession, even if only in a primitive way. Even if they have forgotten these subjects, echoes will linger. We learn a lot in school, often in object lessons, that so often degenerates into platitudes. But in these cases it is found that later in life no feeling remains that leads a person to say, quote, "I once learned about that, and how fortunate I was to have done so," unquote. Instead, the feeling is, quote, "Thank God I have forgotten all that. What a good thing that I have forgotten what I learned then," unquote. We ought never to be responsible for arousing this feeling in a person. If we have been taught in our childhood in a manner that took account of what I have just said, when we later enter a factory or similar place, innumerable resonances will shoot up out of our subconscious. Today everything in life is specialized. This specialization is truly dreadful. And the main reason why so much in life is specialized is because we start to specialize in the way we teach in schools. The gist of these remarks might well be summarized in these words. Every single thing children learn during the course of their schooling should in the end be presented so broadly that threads may everywhere be found linking it with practical human life. Very, very many things that are now anti-social in the world would be made social if we could at least touch upon an insight into matters that later need not have any direct bearing on our own work in life. For instance, we ought to take careful note of what is considered important in school subjects that are still rooted in older, good, though perhaps old-fashioned insights in teaching. In this connection, I want to point to a remarkable phenomenon. When those of us who are now old started on our secondary school courses in Austria at the age of 14 or 15, we had relatively good geometry and arithmetic textbooks. They have now disappeared. A few years ago in Vienna, I hunted through all kinds of second-hand bookshops for older geometry textbooks because I wanted once again to have before my eyes what gave us such delight, for example, in Wiener Neustadt, footnote, Rudolf Steiner's hometown, end of footnote. On the day we entered the first class of the senior school, the boys from the second class met us in the corridor shouting, Fialkowski, Fialkowski, you'll have to pay up tomorrow." We students in the first class took over Fialkowski's geometry textbook from the students of the second class and brought them the money the next day. I actually found one of these Fialkowski geometry books during my hunt. It gave me a great deal of pleasure because it shows that much better geometry books for schools were written in the old tradition than has been the case lately. The present-day books that have replaced the older ones are quite atrocious. The situation in the field of arithmetic and geometry is particularly bad. But if we think back only to the generations just before us, they certainly had better textbooks, which nearly all came from the school of the Austrian Benedictines. It was the Benedictine monks who wrote the mathematical and geometrical books. They were very good because the Benedictine order is the Catholic order that takes great care that its members should be schooled very well in geometry and mathematics. The general conviction within the order is that it is ludicrous for someone to mount the pulpit and speak to the people if he does not know any geometry or mathematics. This ideal of unity that fills the human soul must pulse through all teaching. Something of the world as a totality must live in every profession. In particular, there must be an element of whatever is opposite to the profession, something one thinks will be of hardly any use in that profession. A person must occupy oneself with what is, in a way, the opposite of one's own profession. But one will long for this only if one is taught in the way I have described. It was just at the time when materialism spread far and wide in the last third of the 19th century that this materialism also permeated education to such a degree that specialization came to be considered very important. Please do not subscribe to the belief that you will make children idealistic if during the last years of the lower school and the first of the senior school you avoid showing them how you teach them is linked with practical life. Let me read that again. Please do not subscribe to the belief that you will make children idealistic if during the last years of the lower school and the first of the senior school you avoid showing them how what you teach them is linked with practical life. Do not imagine that they will be more idealistic in later life if you have them write essays on all sorts of sentimental feelings about the world, on the gentleness of the lamb, the fierceness of the lion, and so on, and on God-permeated nature. You do not have an idealistic effect on the children in this way. You will do far better, in fact, to cultivate idealism if you do not approach it so directly, so crudely. Why have people in recent times become so irreligious? For the simple reason that what is now preached is far too sentimental and abstract. People are irreligious now because the church pays so little heed to divine commandments. For instance, there is the commandment, quote, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain," unquote. If you heed this injunction and refrain from mentioning the name Jesus Christ after every fifth sentence, or talking about God's universal order, you are immediately criticized by those so-called church-minded people who would prefer to hear you mention Jesus Christ and God in every sentence. These church-minded circles are the very ones who regard as an irreligious attitude the meek and quiet spirit that seeks to be inwardly penetrated by the divine and avoids uttering Lord, Lord at every moment. If what is presented to human beings by teachers is permeated by this quiet, inwardly working godliness that is not carried sentimentally on the tip of the tongue, the cry resulting from wrong upbringing is heard on every side. "Ah, yes," quote, "he ought to speak far more about Christianity and such things," unquote. We must take care in education not to drag everything learned by the children into sentimentality, especially in their 13th through 15th years, but rather lead what we teach them more toward the workings of practical life. No child ought to reach age 15 without having been guided in arithmetic lessons to an understanding of the rules of at least the simplest forms of bookkeeping. Similarly, the principles of grammar should lead not so much to the kind of essay depicting the human being's inner life as though bathed in a soup of sentimentality, but rather to business compositions, business letters. The former kind of essay, a glorified version of the spirit that reigns when people gather over their wine in the evening or at coffee parties, is the kind of essay usually expected of 13 to 16-year-olds. No child should pass beyond the age of 15 without having gone through the stage of writing specimens of practical business letters. Do not say that the children can learn to do so later. Yes, by overcoming dreadful obstacles they can learn it later, but only if they can overcome these obstacles. It is of great benefit to the children if you teach them to let their knowledge of grammar and language flow into business letters. There should be nobody today who has not at one time learned to write a decent business letter. A person may not need to apply this knowledge in later life at all, but there really should be nobody who has not been encouraged at one time to write a decent business letter. If you satiate the children mainly with sentimental idealism between the ages of 13 and 15, they will later develop an aversion to idealism and become materialistic people. If you lead them during these years into the practical concerns of life, they will retain a healthy relationship to the idealistic needs of the soul, since these can be wiped out only if they are senselessly indulged during early youth. This is extraordinarily important. In this connection, even a few points about the structure of the lessons are of great significance. You know that with regard to the way we teach religion, we shall have to make compromises. As a result of force that one day will fill the sole element of our teaching with a religious quality, cannot at present flow into the rest of our teaching. The fact that we have to compromise in this way stems from the way in which religious bodies have adopted an attitude to the world that is inimical to culture. But even today, if only the religious bodies, for their part, would also make compromises with us, a good deal could flow from this religious instruction squeezed in among the rest of the lessons. It would be beneficial if, for instance, teachers of religion would condescend from time to time to include material from another subject in their lessons. If, for instance, in the midst of their religious lessons, they were able to link what they were saying to an explanation of the steam engine, or an astronomical fact, or something quite worldly, the simple fact that it is the religion teacher who makes this connection would be immeasurably significant for the consciousness of the growing children. I am quoting you this extreme example because in the rest of our lessons we shall have to adopt this method, even though it can be employed only in a limited way in the teaching of religion. We must not allow ourselves to think pedantically, quote, now I am teaching geography and now I am teaching history, I need not bother about anything else, unquote. When we explain to the children that the word sofa came from the Orient during the Crusades, we shall see to it that we then include in the history lesson a description of the way sofas are manufactured. This will lead us on to other items of furniture that are more occidental. In other words, we shall extract something quite novel from the so-called subject of our lesson. This method of teaching is immensely profitable for the growing children because moving from one subject to another in a way that connects one thing with another is more beneficial than anything else for the development of spirit and soul, and even of the body. If a teacher suddenly tells children to their delight about the manufacture of sofas in the middle of a history lesson, leading perhaps to a discussion of oriental carpet patterns and presented in a way that gives them a real view of the subject, such children will have better digestion than children who are taught French lessons, followed by geometry. The child will actually be physically more healthy. Thus we can well structure our lessons in this inwardly healthy way. Today most people suffer from all sorts of digestive disturbances, abdominal disturbances that are the consequence to a great extent of our unnatural teaching. We cannot adapt our teaching to the demands of life. The worst schools in this respect are the upper-class young ladies' colleges. If someone were to make a study of the connection between the teaching of these upper-class young ladies' colleges and the incidence of gynecological illness, it would provide a most interesting chapter in cultural history. We simply must draw attention to such matters so that through avoiding much of what has come to the fore quite recently, healing may enter into this field. Above all, one must know that humans are complicated beings and that what one wants to cultivate in them often requires initial preparation. If you want to gather interested children around you, children who are not specially selected but come from widely varying backgrounds, in order in your religious fervor to tell them about the glories of the divine powers in the world, what you say will go in one ear and out the other. It will never reach their feelings. Having written a business letter with a group of children in the morning, you might have the same group again in the afternoon, carrying in their subconscious what has been activated by the business letter in the morning. You are fortunate if it is now a matter of teaching them religious concepts, for you yourself will have roused in them the mood that is now calling for its opposite. Truly these views are not being put before you as matters of some abstract point of method, but because they are of immense importance for life. I should like to know who has not encountered on going out into life the enormous amount of unnecessary work that is done. Business people will always agree when you outline the following scenario. Take, for example, an employee in some firm. He is told to write a business letter to a related branch or to somebody who is to undertake selling for the firm. He writes this letter and receives an answer. Then he has to write another letter and receives a second answer, and so on. This wasting of time has gained much ground in business life today. We certainly proceed in an immensely uneconomical way in our public affairs. You can sense this. Anyone endowed with ordinary common sense suffers real tortures when glancing at the copy file in any office. This is not the result of an aversion to the forms of address or to the interests depicted there, but because everything is expressed in the most impractical manner possible, and because this file could be reduced to a quarter of its size. The sole reason for this excess is that the schooling of the 14 and 15-year-olds is not arranged in a suitable way. This mismanagement can simply not be made up for later in life. When it is done only by conquering almost insuperable difficulties. The opportunities missed during this period cannot even be made up for at college, because the forces that develop at this time in life peter out and are no longer present in the same form later. You count on these forces when you depend on someone to formulate a letter not just superficially, with only half a mind on the matter, but to give it full attention and express it carefully and clearly. During the first stage of the children's development, from the time they come to school up to the age of 9, it matters most that we should be thoroughly immersed in the nature of the human being, so that we teach entirely out of it. In contrast, it is most important in planning the curriculum for 13 to 15-year-olds that we teachers be immersed in life, that we be interested in life and sympathetic toward it, and that we teach out of the reality of life. I had to say all this to you before going on to put together the ideal curriculum for you, after which we shall compare this ideal curriculum with the ones that will play a part in your teaching, for we are surrounded everywhere with the external world and its organization. The end of Lecture 12.